Hello, and welcome to today's lesson. This is going to be part 2 of going over questions under the study island function operations and compositions. So part 1 focused on the operations part. In this video, part 2 is going to focus on the compositions part. So I've pulled the problems out of this lesson in study island that can be done using the calculator TI-84, and these problems are also associated with the Algebra 2 standard in Oklahoma 2.1a. In our first problem that dealing with compositions of functions, it gives us two functions and asks us what is the composition. So because my answers have x's in them and it's not just a number, I'm going to have to compare the graph of the composition to the graph of the answers provided and look for one where the graphs are identical. So my first step is to go into y equals. And I'm going to clear out anything that I have in there so that I don't get confused. And I'm going to start with y1. And I'm going to type in what f of x is for y1. So it's going to be x squared minus 2x plus 11. And then y2, I'm going to put in what g of x is, which is 4x. And then y3, I'm going to put in the composition. But instead of using f and g, because I've assigned f as y1 in the calculator and g as y2 in the calculator, I'm going to type this in as it looks, but instead of using f, I'm going to use y1, and instead of using g, I'm going to use y2. So to get the y1, I have to go underneath the vars button. So I press vars, and I scroll over to y vars. And then I need that first choice function. And then there's my y1, so I press enter, and the y1 shows up. And then I'm going to need the parenthesis, just like it shows in the problem. And then I have the g, so that means y2, so I go back to vars, scroll to the right, enter, scroll down to y2 is highlighted and press enter, and that puts a y2 in my problem. And then I'm going to have a parenthesis, x, parenthesis, parenthesis, just like it shows in the problem. Only thing is I put y1 instead of f and y2 instead of g. And so now I have assigned y3 to be the composition of the function. And I need to compare the graph of y3 to the graphs of the answers to find the one that's identical to it. So when I go to do this, I don't need to see the graph of y1 and y2, so I'm going to tell the calculator to only graph y3, to not graph y1 and y2. So to do that, I use my arrow buttons to scroll over so it's flashing over the equal sign, and I press enter to unhighlight it. And I do the same with y1. And so the calculator will only graph the functions here that have the highlighted equal sign. So right now it's only going to graph y3, but I'm going to, in y4, I'm going to put in choice A to see if that gives me the same graph or not. So choice A is 4x squared minus 8x plus 11. And now when I'm comparing graphs, I find it helpful to make the first one a skinny line and the second one a thick line. So to do that, I scroll over to in front of y4, and so that my cursor is blinking over top of that skinny line, and I press enter once, and that tells it now to graph it as a thick line. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that, and I'm going to graph it by pressing the zoom button and then choosing the 6 choice standard, so I get that standard screen. So that way I know if I need to zoom in or out once it's graphed. And there's the thick line. And I don't see a skinny line, so that means it might be way up here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. So I'm going to press zoom and out and press enter. And I'm going to move the spider to where I want to center the screen. So maybe the graph is up high, so I'm going to go ahead and move it up to see if that helps me find where that skinny graph is. And now it moved up and I can see that I had the two graphs and that they're not overlapping, that there's two separate parabolas there. And if you wanted to see it a bit clearer, you could go ahead and mess with the window some more by pressing window. And I don't need all the negatives, so I'm going to start it at -5 and take it up to 40. And I'm going to tell it to go by 5 so that the screen isn't so cluttered. And then the same with the y, -5, and we'll do 45 and do it by 5s, and we'll see if that helps. So there's the skinny graph. And there's the thick graph. So you can see definitely now that they are separate. The skinny line is here and the thick line is here. They did not graph on top of each other. So that means I'm going to need to try choice B. So I'm going to go back into y equals and scroll down to y4, because that's where I'm typing in my answers, and clear it out. And now I'm going to go ahead and type in choice B. So that's going to be 16x squared minus 8x plus 11. And then once again, I want to tell this to be a thick line. So I'm going to press enter once to change it to a thick line. And then I'm going to go to the window, and I think maybe if I saw a little bit more of the x-axis, that could be helpful. But I'm going to keep that same window since that's how I had to find the skinny graph. And so I'm waiting for it to graph, and there goes my skinny graph. And there goes my thick graph right on top of it. And I could tell that it was still working because there was lines moving over here that show me that it's still working. And so here the graphs graphed right on top of each other. So that means B is going to be my final answer. So for this problem, I'm doing another composition of a function, but this time I'm evaluating the composition of the function. So I do not have to look at the graph because I have an actual number here. So it's going to be done a little bit differently. One tidbit of information that you need to know is that when a problem is written F, this little circle G, that's the composition, and that's the same as writing it as F parenthesis G parenthesis X parenthesis, like we saw in the last problem. So that means that when it's asking for the composition evaluated at -2, that could also be written with the parentheses like I have here. And that's going to be handy for when I'm using the calculator, because when I use the calculator, I have to write it this way. I can't write it with the little circle. So you have to be able to translate it with just the parentheses to use the calculator. So I'm still going to start with my y equals, so I'm going to go ahead and clear out everything from the old problem so I don't have anything in here that would mess up my problem. And I'm going to go ahead and type f of x into y1. So it's going to be x to the 4th, so I use the caret button to make the exponent of 4. That's all I want in my exponent, so I'm going to right arrow out of it, so the rest of my problem is not in the exponent. And then I have minus 2x squared plus 2. And then I'm going to put g of x into y of 2, so second square root. The square root button's above the squared. And then x plus 2, right arrow out. And there I have g of x in there. So now I just have to tell y3 to be the composition, because that's what I'm going to actually be using. So it means I'm going to type this into y3, only instead of using f, I use y1, because that's what f of x is in the calculator. Instead of using g, I'm going to use y2, because that's what g is in the calculator. So to get my y's, I go to the vars button, right arrow so that y vars is collected, and then I want that first choice, so press enter, and then there's my y1. It's highlighted, so I press enter. And then I'm going to do a parenthesis, and then I need g, which is y2, so I repeat those steps, and then scroll down to y2 and press enter, and then parenthesis x, parenthesis, parenthesis. And now y3 is the composition. So since I don't need to know the graphs, since my answers are numbers, I'm going to go ahead and go to the home screen and clear it out. and I'm going to be looking at the composition of -2. Well, y3 is the composition, so I'm going to do vars and get my y3, scroll down, and then I'm going to evaluate that at -2, like the problem tells me to, and then I press enter, and there my answer is 2, which is choice D, my final answer. This last problem, you have to work it a little bit backwards than the problems that we have been doing in this section, because they give you the answer and they want to know which two of these would make the composition of 5 absolute value x plus 7. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my y equals, and once again, I'm going to have to compare the composition of an answer choice to the actual answer that I'm giving up here. So once again, I'm going to keep that same pattern of putting f of x for y1, g of x for y2, their composition for y3, and the answer for y4, just to keep everything straight and consistent with what I had been doing so that I make less mistakes. So I'm going to, letter A here gives me that the choice for f of x is 5 absolute value x. So I'm going to type 5, and to get absolute value, I have to press math, scroll over to number, and then ABS here stands for absolute value. So I'm going to press that, and there pops the absolute value signs, and I'm going to put an x in there. And that's all I need in there, so I'm going to scroll right out of it. And then A says g of x is going to be 7x, so I'm going to 7x. And then y3 is going to be the composition. So I'm going to have to go to vars, scroll to the right, enter, enter to get the y1, and then parenthesis, and then vars, scroll to the right, enter, down, enter to get y2, and then parenthesis, x, parenthesis, parenthesis, and that shows the composition of f of x and g of x. And I know that that composition is going to have to equal 5 absolute value x plus 7. So I'm going to type that in, 5, and then get absolute value, I press math, scroll over to num, and then that first choice, and there I need an x plus 7. And so I made sure to scroll out of the absolute value before I press the plus 7 so that only x would be in the absolute value. And so I'm only concerned with comparing the composition of f and g and the actual 5x absolute value of x plus 7. So I'm going to unhighlight the equal signs of y1 and y2 so that I'm only looking at those. And I'm going to make the second one a thick line so that I can tell the difference. So I'm going to go ahead and graph those, and I want to make sure I know what window I'm looking at. So instead of pressing graph, I'm going to press zoom standard. And there was a thick line, but it's real close. It's hard to tell what I'm looking at there. So I'm going to go ahead and press zoom, and I'm going to press zoom out. But I'm going to have it center it, so I move my little spider cursor. I'm going to have it center the screen right there. So it's going to move it down. And hopefully I can see a bit better. So there goes the skinny line. And there goes the thick line. So it's definitely two different graphs. So I know that that's not going to be my answer. Now for the sake of time, I'm going to try choice C. So I've already typed f of x into y1 and unhighlighted the equal sign, and typed g of x into y2 and unhighlighted the equal sign. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that. And here comes my skinny line. And then here comes my thick line right on top of it. So that means choice C is going to be my final answer. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.